I still can't listen to Michael W. Smith today. I just can't. I'm sure he's a great man and a wonderful person.
To each his own.
Preferences.
Pastor Mike Adkins is here to talk about the one principle that can help us move past our differences. Whether it's political, personal, or theological, there is a way to lead a quiet and peaceful life in a world full of conflict. I hope you'll find this conversation helpful. I sure did. I'm Jeanne Harrison, and this is Grace After Hours. I feel like there's been sort of a tension in the church that I feel like there's been a lot more anger, there's been division, there's been some spiritual exhaustion. Recently you preached and you talked about all of those things, and you actually linked it to something really surprising. I thought you opened your sermon by saying that if we could get this one thing through our minds, it would be transformative. We would see an end to a lot of the anger, the division, the exhaustion. And the thing was, never let a preference rise to the level of a conviction.
That's right.
What did you mean by that? Tell me about it.
So I guess what I would say first is that when we go back to the Bible doesn't give us tons of it gives us a few convictions, few convictions that are very, very important. But I think what we've done over time is we've added a lot of man-made rules and a lot of man-made ideas to our faith, right? And not all of these ideas are bad. I mean, we're called to continue to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, right? So one of the things that I was talking about when I was saying never let your preferences rise to the level of a conviction is today, it seems like every Christian, most Christians, that's an exaggeration, but a lot of Christians today have some kind of view about every subject out there. You know, when Thessalonians is saying, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life.
That was my favorite part of the sermon.
Yeah.
When you said this is the Bible way of saying, shut up.
Yeah. I mean, Paul is saying, I want you guys not to have an opinion on everything. And it's interesting because we think that's spiritual. And the problem is that what we have is preferences. And preferences are just it's preferring one thing or it's choosing one thing over another. All of us have preferences. But you can't take a preference and then raise it up to a level of a conviction, because convictions are stuff that should be held very strongly and should not be negotiated away. But preferences can always be negotiated away.
Okay, but how do you tell the difference between those things? Because I think most people would say their preferences are based on their convictions. It's like maybe whether it's a political preference or it's where I send my kids to school, public or private. I feel like there are people who could make an argument for it having a biblical basis.
Sure.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I do, but I think you can make an argument for anything. What
having
I would say,
a biblical basis?
Sure. I mean, one time when we first started the church, I preached an entire message. The whole point of this message was to say that if you don't take the Bible in the context that it was written, you can make it say anything. So the first 10 minutes before I even told them, my goal of my sermon was to say, let's read from Paul's words about marriage. It is better for you not to marry, right? That way, when you give yourself to the Lord, you don't have to be distracted or separated. And my whole point of the message for the first 10, 15 minutes of the message was, you shouldn't be married. It's less than God's will for your life. Now, that's not true.
Sure.
Right. But Paul says that because it was Paul's preference. He wasn't something that he was saying all Christians should do. He's like, I prefer this. If I have to make the choice between getting married and devoting my entire life to Jesus, where I won't be distracted with kids and marriage and all that stuff, that's what I choose to do. But he wasn't saying, now let's make a preference a law or, a conviction.
So how would you define the two? If someone's sitting here going, I don't know, maybe some of my preferences or maybe some of my convictions actually shouldn't be convictions. Maybe they should be preferences. Yeah. What's the difference?
That's a great question. So I think convictions come right out of Scripture. I think that we find those.
But you just said we can take a lot. We could say it's better not to marry. That comes right out of Scripture.
Right. So, but the point of what I was saying earlier was you can speak. You can take any part of the Scriptures and make it say whatever you want it to. Mm-hmm. So one of the interpreted lenses that we have is that we are always working to find the author's original intention in what we do. We don't ask ourselves first, what does this mean to me? That's an important question, but it comes long after we've done the work of figuring out what was the author's original intention in doing what we're doing. So if you're looking at preferences, and some people's preferences do rise out of convictions, but what we have to recognize is we can't treat a preference the same as a conviction, right? A conviction is, this is a biblical truth that I cannot negotiate away in my life. Whereas preferences are things that can be negotiated away. Like, for example, in the Bible, right? Should you baptize by sprinkling or dunking, right? Now, there are some people, there are some denominations that have made that to the level of a conviction, when the Bible doesn't say that that's a level of conviction, and Christianity as a whole has treated that subject very differently. There are plenty of people who are paedo-Baptists, sprinkle babies and do that, right? Reformed people, Catholic people, the opposite side of the spectrum, they do the same kind of thing. And then you have Baptists that are like, no way, man. The word baptismo means to submerge, even though that was a descriptive reality, not a prescriptive reality. And so when we're looking at the Bible, we have to understand, like, there are certain things where Jesus and Paul and the apostles, they're laying out, here's what we did, but not necessarily what you have to do for all of eternity, right? And so as the church looked at this, they kind of teased it out and go, well, some traditions make this make more sense, and some traditions make this make more sense. And to me, that's a preference. It's not a conviction. You know what the conviction is? Be baptized. Okay. That's what the Bible tells us to do. It doesn't tell us the mode or methodology. It just says, be baptized. And so anything beyond that, you're preferring to choose one method over another method. And the same kind of thing with speaking in tongues in some ways and other things in the Bible.
So how could I tell that maybe I've taken a preference and I've elevated it? What are the signs that that's something I'm doing or have done?
So I'll go back to your earlier question. And I think what's important is, like, we see a lot of people angry today, a lot of people frustrated. And I think, like, if you're walking the way of Jesus, it's not a way of anger. Now, somebody will listen to this and go, Jesus was pretty angry at the temple, but that's just one situation. Jesus wept when he saw Jerusalem in the situation that it was in. He was brokenhearted. The Bible said he was a man of sorrows. So it wasn't all joy and peace. It was a hard thing. Almost all of life at some point or another is suffering. It's hard. But to me, I think what happens today is people make every little issue, politics,
parenting philosophies,
yes. Baptism,
yes.
Speaking in tongues. Should you raise your hands in church
Everything.
or not?
Should you wear a hat on stage?
Should you wear a hat on stage? We've had that, right? I mean, we had somebody come in with that, right? And yet, I think the problem is that when you take every preference and you say, this is a conviction, there's no room for compromise anywhere. And so if you're a Christian where there's no room for compromise because you have all convictions, it's a very immature view. And it's not what Paul teaches. Or Jesus.
You know, I think I used to really think, like, when I got older, like a sign of spiritual maturity would be I have all the answers. Like, I have more convictions. And I actually think that now, the older I get, I feel like it's the opposite. I feel like it's marked by humility. I look at Clint and I, when we came out of, I didn't go to seminary, but when he came out of seminary and I went to Bible college, we had convictions about everything, like so many. And we're using that term kind of like, you're saying conviction, like, right, we had strong beliefs about, and it really was this superior attitude. And I look at Clint now and there's so much more humility where it's like, no, I'm going to listen and consider. And I think that's actually spiritual maturity.
Yeah, same. I think it's spiritual maturity. And I think we all kind of go through that. And by the way, almost everybody that I talk to that's older, that's walked with Jesus for a long time, says exactly the same thing that you just said, which is over time we realize that we need to take our hands off of a lot of the things because, again, our faith is not control. Our faith is trust, right? That's what faith is. Faith is trust. It's not control. I can't manipulate, manage, or, negotiate away all the problems in my life because I develop convictions. No, sometimes you just need to be able to sit there and go, all right, preferences are simply choosing one thing over another thing, whereas convictions are strongly held beliefs, right? So we're able to basically say, there are certain things, and for me, as I've gotten older, I think humility is definitely part of that whole equation. But what's also true is, because I know there's some people probably listening to this go, humility just sounds like you're not doing in the work of like trying to figure things out. And for me, that's super important because I'm a teacher. I love that. But I am way more certain about fewer things than I hold those things without negotiation. Like for me, the essentials of our faith, Jesus being God. I'm not coming out every year going, is that still true for me? I know it's true for me once and for all. I know there's a heaven, there's a hell. I know that he loves me And these things I'm absolutely sure about. But do I care if somebody's a Republican or a Democrat? I really don't. See, I feel like that's going to go on the internet. And then somebody's going to go, man, that just means that you're not following God's will. But this is the problem with preferences that rise to the level of convictions. You stop thinking because you made a decision. Whereas for someone who looks at that and goes, it's my preference to be in this political party or the next, right? Whereas I think if you go and you look in the Bible, and I heard somebody say this recently, like if you feel super comfortable in one of the parties, you're missing a big piece of Jesus.
Wow.
Yeah. And I love that because I do think that in one party you see the beauty and the goodness of God in some ways and a lot of fault and failure.
Sure.
In the other party you see a little bit of Jesus and the beauty and the goodness and a lot of fault and failure. These parties are kingdoms of the world. They're not our kingdom. We have a king, not a president, not a senator, not a governor. Those things are important. But they're not that important.
And would you say that like there are issues there politically that you could have like that are moral issues that you could have a biblical conviction about without saying Republicans are all right, Democrats are all right.
Right.
Either way, is that?
I wish that were true. I mean, I wish that's actually how people negotiated their lives. You know what I mean? I long for the days because I did grow up in a time where politics was like this. Politics has always been nasty because again, it's the kingdom of the world. It's about power. It's about maintenance. It's about me. Very few servants in politics today, But there was a day when you would see people fight on the floor and then they go to lunch together afterwards and they'd hang out, right? Because today, because we take all these preferences and we make them rise to the level of conviction. I have convictions about everything. I'm 100% sure about what I believe. Right. The problem comes now that when I'm 100% sure about what I believe and you believe the opposite of that, you look like a demon to me. Versus a person created in the image of God who thinks differently. And man, we can't go anywhere with that.
You almost could say, I wonder, tell me what you think of this, that then the preference has become a form of your identity. And that's why if you reject that, you reject me, which I'll give you an example.
I would say identity, yes, but idolatry. They become the most important things to us.
And maybe that's a sign that my preference, it's the most important. So I'll tell you, and then I want to know from your own life where you have changed here. But
sure.
You know this, that Clint and I, probably one of the biggest fights we've had through our whole marriage has been clean, messy. And it sounds really dumb, like how you keep a home, right?
Sure.
Like, do you be organized or do you just throw your stuff everywhere?
And Jeanne, you gotta clean up once in a while. I'm just saying, like, Clint cannot be doing all the work at home. You just can't.
Edit. Okay. No, but so in all seriousness,
I love how you didn't even acknowledge that it wasn't Clint.
You have to know. You just have to know, assume. The thing is, for me, and Clint would say forever, this is your idol. And I was like, no, I could argue till I'm purple in the face why it really is morally superior. It's disciplined. It's like, it shows thoughtfulness to other people to pick up your stuff. Like, I could go through all this. But the truth is, it took me being in counseling for a counselor to actually use that word. She said, Jeanne, this is a preference. And I was like, I don't know that I agree with that. I feel like this is the thing is a lot of people have to get to a point where they're convinced that their preference is not actually a conviction. A reality. Yes. But it's hard to get there. And I think that's what made me so judgmental. And like,
it's what makes everybody judgmental.
But I would say this too, Mike, it goes back to my upbringing. It goes back to my own story and possibly even, I feel like people use the word trauma too much, but just dysfunction in my own self and my own upbringing.
Sure.
And I wonder if sometimes that's why, because I sometimes wonder, why do people have certain hot button issues? Like their preference is, do you know what I mean? Like where does that come from? That you're going to get all stressed out about a hat on, you know what I mean? Where do you think these preferences come from? That is it because of our stories? Is it our trauma? Is it just because?
Yeah. I mean, I think it can come from any of those things. It can come from a past trauma. It can come from background. It can come from experience. It's definitely coming from previous learning.
Yes.
Whatever it is, it's coming from previous learning because everything we have today comes from previous learning, right? And so whenever we're thinking about preferences, we have to realize that they're not neutral. They're biased. Like my because it's a preference. It's you choosing one thing over another. I'm biased in choosing this thing over this thing for some reason, right? And it may not be based on reality.
Yeah.
And that's where the hard thing is for a lot of people. They think to themselves, well, my political opinion on this is absolutely right. And therefore, because it's part of my identity and my idolatry, God must think exactly the same way as me. I had a huge hit on this, and it was this moment where I felt like my Americanism, my patriotism, and the Bible might have been colliding with one another. And so I had an issue in my life, and I had a firm preference here, right? And I was like, this is what I think is true. And then I started thinking about the implications of it. This is good for all the situations that I was thinking about in our country. And then there was something inside my heart that was just like, man, I feel uneasy making this preference a conviction in my life. So instead of making this preference a conviction in my life, I went to Scripture and I looked up the issue. And I just found every Bible verse that I could in the Bible, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And I looked at it and I was like, okay, well, if this is how my patriotism feels about something, and this is the issue the Bible says, they did collide with each other. There was just an intuitive sense that I thought there would be a problem between these two. And then what happened was, when I looked in the Scriptures, it was clear that it required a compassionate response instead of a strong response. It required patience instead of like immediate decision making. And as a result of that, I just changed my opinion on this whole subject. I mean, it went 180. I came in with this one view, and then I left with the other view, because what I realized was, if I'm going to develop convictions in my life, not just preferences, but convictions in my life, they have to flow out of what the Bible teaches, not what I want the Bible to say.
Yes. Which I feel like is kind of the point. You don't have to have an answer for every single thing. You can sometimes wrestle with the tension. And I think what I hear from what you're saying is, it goes back to your heart. Is there a heart of compassion? Because I could sit all day and say, clean house, morally superior. But if I'm spewing venomous hate to everyone to get it clean, who's really the one sinning?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, two people could have the same beliefs, even about a political issue, but one could do it they could believe the exact same thing. One could do it with a heart of compassion, and one could have hate. And who's really the one who's sinning there? You know what I mean? I don't think it's maybe the issue so much as it is, am I seeking Jesus? Do I want to be like him?
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And control, again, I think is a big thing behind a lot of our preferences. We prefer certain things, I think, because they make us feel better. And that's not always a good reason. You know, in fact, Jesus often made the disciples feel very on edge. I mean, Peter, get behind me, Satan. You know, when they said, when are you going to show me the Father? Jesus like, are you so blind? Do you not see? So he was constantly putting people on their heels at times. And I think part of that was because he was saying, like, the way that you're going to find truth in me is to find me, not your opinions about me, not your preferences, but me.
And when you encounter the real Jesus, I feel like I read this in Gentle and Lowly. They were saying that the posture of Jesus' heart when he sees sin and brokenness and ugly things has always been to run toward, never to run away from it. Right. And I think that's where a lot of, we've fallen short in the last few years. And I just talked to a girl yesterday who is just this beautiful, wonderful person, crying in a living room, talking about how she walked away from the church in the last several years because of the hate and this is why this is a high stakes issue. There's a lot that hangs in the balance when Christians don't do this, and she's just now coming back because she has kids and she wants to raise them in church, and she's really wrestling with what are the essentials of the faith. Right. But it really cost a lot. You know,
it does. It's a major. I think it's been a major force for the de-churching of America.
Yes, 100%.
And that, you're right, it is a major issue because, and I also think that though that shows us our way into these folks' hearts and lives and then back into church, which is the church needs to be more compassionate. I mean, the fruits of the Spirit are compassionate, love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, right? Goodness, gentleness, those kinds of things, right? And so I think, like, our job is to show the more beautiful story, to show the world that even though, and I love this because, I mean, just when we're talking about preferences and convictions, you know, it seems even like Jesus has these moments where he's got certain convictions, but he also has preferences. And when you see it in Jesus, it's like almost unnerving. Like, for example, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's like, Lord, I prefer if you can take this away from me, this cup would pass, then I would be, that'd be great. That's my preference. But here's my conviction. I'm going to do your will no matter what.
Wow.
So whatever your will is, that's what I'm going to do, God. And I think that is such a great example to all of us to say, I have to submit all of my preferences, even if I believe they're based on biblical ideas, but I have to submit my preferences to him so that I can gain his convictions for my life. And I really do believe convictions are few and far between. I mean, the early church, when they started responding to heresy inside the church, they developed the great creeds, right? Like the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, the Athanasian Creed, all of these things, very beautiful. But at the same time, what they affirm is just very little. Like when you look at our systematic theology books today, they're like this, and the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed are like this. I believe in God the Father Almighty, right? And so there was almost kind of like a basicness to Christian faith back then that we've made super complicated. And then I think when you start piling preferences on all over the place, the average Christian just feels burdened and overwhelmed because how do I manage having an opinion about everything?
And to be clear, when we talk about compassion, we are not talking about compassion at the expense of truth.
That's right.
One of Grace's core values is grace-centered truth.
Yeah.
We are all about holiness. We are all about standing for the truth. We're just saying, as we stand for the truth, we do it with a spirit of love in the same way that Jesus would.
That's right.
Can you tell me from your own life, I'm just curious, are there things that rose to the level of convictions that you've now said, I'm going to put them back into the place of preference, whether church issues or just personal issues, like my clean house one, like was something in your life?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I had to work that through with Kelly. She's very messy. So that's completely not true. No. I think there are a lot of things, and I think for me, I mean, okay, so let's talk about like very early Christian faith. I think some people go through this. I went to a small college, just my freshman year. I went to Wheaton College, but I went to another college my freshman year called Toccoa. It's in Northeast Georgia. And it was a sweet little school, but it was a little bit more legalistic than the way I grew up. I remember just driving in my 1982 Camaro, and I think I came onto campus with AC/DC, Back in Black, just kind of blasting, and I was a brand new Christian. I didn't know anything. I remember parking, pulling over. I got this first series of friends, and they were all like, Mike, man, listen, you got to get rid of secular music if you're going to love Jesus, man. The lyrics are just not good, and you got to get rid of that. And that's hard to like argue with, because you're kind of like, yeah, that's not all good, And then I started listening to Christian music, and I was like, that's not all good.
In a different way.
I was like, this is wretched. And I was like, I still can't listen to Michael W. Smith today. I just can't. I'm sure he's a great man and a wonderful person.
To each his own.
Preferences.
Right.
And so at some point, like I came back around and I realized, this was just kind of like a weird form of legalism, right? That I had preferred in one time of my life. The reason was control. I felt like if I could just control what was coming into my life in this way, then what the output would be great. Jesus said the opposite of that. He said, it's not what goes into a man that defiles him. He said it's what flows out of his heart. And so in my mind, like how I've kind of come to understand this teaching is, it's not just something that goes into you. Like it's not the bad things a person says to you that destroys the heart. It's what happens in your mind and in your heart in between the person saying something terrible or something bad coming into your life, and then how you interpret that. That's why I think convictions are so important, because when we hold on to the convictions, Jesus loves me. He's forgiven me. There is no condemnation in my life. So when someone says something terrible, and I'm able to go, there's no condemnation in my life, and I'm not going to accept that. I'm not going to receive that. Then what comes out of it is a sense of peace and joy. I'm able to go, thanks for saying that, man, but it doesn't impact me. Kelly always tells me, she's like, you're very seldomly worried about what people say about you. And I'm like, it's only because for a long, long time, I had people saying terrible things, in my family. And I had to get to this place where I cut that off and said, where I'm going to get my truth about me is not going to be from another person. It's going to be from what the Bible says about me. And so it's not what comes into a person, but it's what comes out. So once you fix that in between, what comes in and what goes out, that middle right there, once you get a hold of that, it changes how you respond to people. So someone could say something terrible to you and you can just go, thanks, man, and move on. Like move on, not really just smile and move on.
Right.
So I had that. And then in seminary years, I was so reformed in every single little thought process that I had. And it's not like I'm not that way anymore, but I hold so loose to it.
Yes.
I mean, it's just not a thing. I
It's
don't
in its proper
enjoy the
place.
culture. I don't enjoy a lot of people are real bullies with it, and I just don't see that. I found this like really beautiful part of it where, you know, you've got Jonathan Edwards, and he's talking about he's widely recognized, I think, as one of the greatest American theologians. But he talked about the affections of the heart and how you have to change not just your mind, but your whole self towards God. And he painted beautiful pictures of God and then the glory and the goodness of God. That's what attracted me to those things. Often it's turned into kind of a control thing. If you don't have this doctrine, you don't have this polity, you don't have this ecclesiology, you don't have these things, then your whole life falls short.
It's less than.
Yeah, it's less than. And we see that in a lot of denominations, different kinds of things. Methodists have their own version of that. Assemblies of God have their own versions of that. So we love to create systems to make others feel bad about themselves.
I like when you said that it's what comes out, because I feel like that could be a good gauge for if I were going to a church to say, hey, why do you do things this way? But what's coming out is just this hate and this like, then that's a sign.
It is.
Do you know what I almost wonder, like, are you ever in a right place if you are coming from a spirit of rage about something? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, especially if that's the predominant feeling. You know?
Right.
God gave us anger for a reason, and God was angry himself. And so there's a righteous form of anger, but I think it's very easy to say my form of anger is righteous always. And I think that's silly. I mean, I think we always have to be looking at ourselves and questioning ourselves with that kind of sin. So there's a part of me that just thinks, like, you know, coming to a church and the church has all these preferences. Grace has preferences, you know? And so we've got preferences. So we have preferences. We like modern worship, you know? We like ancient practices inside of our modern worship, right? Like communion. We do, everyone comes forward and takes communion in our services. We have confession. I mean, for a modern church, that's like 99% of those churches are not doing that. And we just take a moment during the service to get quiet, confess privately. We do corporate confessions. And the reason why we do these things is because they're preferences. There's nothing in the Bible that says you better come and do a confession at church. We do it because it's worked for us. So when someone comes and says, why do you do that? We go, it's just grace culture. We don't say it's Bible. We don't say, because it's not a conviction of the Bible. The Bible says confess your sins one to another, you know, and you'll be healed. So good things happen from confession, but how you manage the systems and the methods of things really is almost always some kind of preference. Convictions flow from what God says about us and about his world.
Okay, tell me this.
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody who just flat out refuses to recognize that their preference is a preference?
Yeah.
Is that where you just be quiet and part way?
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point. Like, my preference of you not having preferences is like in making them.
You don't sit there and argue with that. You
Absolutely
just kind
not.
of.
No.
Why do you think that people nowadays feel such a need to share their opinion on everything? Do you think that's like always been? Do you think that's because of social media? Why do we feel like I have to post on, not just have an opinion on everything, but I have to share my opinion on everything?
I don't think that's how it's always been. It certainly hasn't always been that way in the Christian world. And you have to recognize that there were certain times in history where you weren't allowed to have an opinion publicly about things like that. Frankly, if you're a Christian right now in the Middle East, you're not allowed to have an opinion publicly about things. So they don't fly off at the mouth at any kind of subject. Sometimes faith is very personal to people. I think the reason, I think you hit one of them, which is technology. We have a technological world right now where we're actually given strokes for being outrageous or being, kind of just controversial. And I always feel like our podcast, as an example, I don't feel like we're like trying to be intentionally controversial. That's not who we are. Like our thing is we want to add value and want to add goodness to someone's life. And if it's helpful, it's helpful. And if it's not, it's not. I mean, this is not the Bible either. This is just friends talking.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I think it's technology, and I think today it's control. You
keep coming back to control.
I just think it's such a big thing. Yeah. I mean, just like, when people pick I'm just going to combine two things that you said earlier. Like, first, the thing of, that we derive our preferences or our convictions from our preferences, or our preferences from our convictions.
Yes.
And then I think, like, the reason why I think that's so important is because people will be like, here's my opinion. Here's where I stand. And they're angry about it. And you know what? They've never done anything else about it. So there's a lie. It's a control lie at the heart of that proclamation. That proclamation is, I stand in this camp. But really, what have you done? You don't stand in that camp. You ran your mouth. You've never done anything about that issue.
And how is that
You've
tied
never
to
changed
control,
a person's
though?
life.
Like,
because now I feel in control of that situation, because I've just said, I'm standing here, but it's freed me from having to do anything else about it. Whereas I think a faithful response to the situation like that would be, whatever the social issue is, you can't just go, I stand here. That's worthless. That doesn't mean anything. But pridefully and in control, you feel like I have done something about it. It's like a weird delusional lie.
Pretend I'm watching this or listening to this podcast. I'm sitting here thinking, okay, there are some areas in my life that preferences have risen to the level of convictions. I would like to submit those things to God and put them back in the proper place.
Right.
I don't want to be ruled by control or fear,
Right.
Anger. Give me some takeaways. What do I do? Give me a nugget. Like, what can I do to get that thing back where it needs to be?
Yeah. I think for one of the, like, just a great exercise would be to write down the things that you've, like, take a piece of paper and write down the word gospel and write down everything you think is inside the gospel. Okay. The reason why I would ask you to do that is because, first of all, you might come to a place where you go, I don't really know. I was teaching a class a while back. This was years ago. And I said, give me the definition of gospel. And the person would go, Jesus died for me. I was like, it's part of it. It's not the whole thing, but let's keep going. And it was really hard for people to narrow that down. So first thing is, do you know what you really have convictions about? So find out what are you really convicted about? Like, at the heart of being a Christian is the gospel. It's everything. You know, it is absolutely necessary for us to be able to understand that, write it out, you know, and then from there, ask yourself, what are the things that feel most urgent to me and most important? Put them in a separate category. Then ask yourself, like, which one of these things am I willing to actually commit my life to help in a practical way? And if the answer is, you know, 2 of these, then take those 2 things and jump in with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? And then the rest of them, they're just preferences. The other ones, convictions. And people can have convictions about the social issues that we were talking about. They absolutely can. But the question is not, you know, can you or can you not have convictions about this or that? Because remember, whenever I choose this over that, I'm making a preference. Okay? A conviction is something that comes down from God to us. They are the historical understandings of the Christian faith. It's interesting, like, our culture always teaches us that we have to create our own identity, when the reality is much of our identity has been given to us in and through Christ. Like, we know who we are because we're followers of Jesus. We follow Yahweh, you know? And so that shapes the very nature of who we are as people, right? And so when we have all these other convictions out here, you know, it can be anything. It could be eco stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you're going to look at it from the Bible, yeah, God said you're stewards over my creation. Do a good job with that, right? So that's a great thing. But in my list, it doesn't, like, rise to the level of, like, Jesus died for me.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So that's a conviction. Jesus died for me. And it's a conviction that is so central to who I am that if you peeled off that part of my identity, I don't know in any way who I would be. Like, yeah, it's already hard for me to even think about. Like, I would try to think about what I would do the very next day, and I have absolutely no idea. Not only because I'm a pastor, but because it's who I am. Like, those things, those convictions are core to my identity, right? And preferences shouldn't be.
But I like how you made this other category. So, for example, if we're using you, that's core to your identity.
Yeah.
But you could say the desire to reach Central Florida with the gospel, the calling on your life, that's not necessarily your identity.
Right.
But in the same way, the
That's
eco
how I
guy,
live out the identity.
the eco guy can give his life to that because it's a strong. You can give your life to this mission, but it's still not all the way your core conviction of who you are.
That's right.
But you have given your life to it. It's how you're choosing to
It's how I express the fact that Jesus is in my life. I think sometimes it's a weird thing, but, like, I don't think people think a lot about how, like, why pastors are where they are. I think that probably makes sense because pastors go into pastoring for different reasons. Some unhealthy reasons and some healthy reasons, right?
Sure.
And I've talked to Grace about this before, and I'm like, guys, the reason why I'm a pastor today is because I'm a Christian. like my Christian faith, as I started walking from Toccoa through Wheaton and then getting married, my Christian life led me to leading some Bible studies in the local church. And those Bible studies blew up and grew. And, the pastor came and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about being in ministry?" And I'm like, "No, I want to live in a gated community," and I went home and told my wife, and I said, "Can you believe what this guy said?" And she's like, "Yeah." And so my Christian life was just unfolding, and somehow as a Christian, I landed on the stage of grace. And I think that's just because God led me there and because it's my Christian life. Everything flows out of my commitment to Jesus and out of my relationship with Jesus in my life. Everything flows out. Everything that's good in my life flows out of that relationship.
It's flowing in the right direction because the conviction is the first, and it's flowing out of that instead of starting with this preference and then that flow. It doesn't work. I think that's one of the things that's a great point, because I think a lot of people just try to choose causes and issues. Yes.
And when they're trying to choose cause and issue, they're trying to wrap it back to something inside of themselves. And I'm going, no. At the core of who I am, Jesus is God. I'm called to wrap my entire life around helping people take their next step toward Christ.
And in some ways, would you say this is what it looks like to lead a quiet life, to not champion every single thing online, to not...
I think it's part of it for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's part of it. And you know what's great, Jeanne, is I really genuinely feel like if people will grab a hold of this, it will take their temperature down from, 100 degrees to being like 60.
Yeah.
Because now I just, when someone says something about it, I go, it's interesting. And I move on. Because in my role, people are always coming to the church and saying, here's what the church needs to be about. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. I like your thing. I like your cause. And it's been anything over the years. It can be anything from like a multi-level marketing thing that helps everybody get rich at our church. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm not called to do that.
Yeah.
To like eco things.
Good things.
Good things.
Yeah.
Good things. I want people to have more money, and I want people to take care of the environment.
Sure.
And
Fostering, adoption, there's a million things.
You know? But just like a person can only do a few things well, a church can only do a few things well. And when you start doing everything, you do nothing.
And you make a good point that it's also for yourself. It's not just
it is
like,
for yourself too.
Honestly, I don't want to be angry and screaming at everyone about a house. That doesn't feel good. It's not the best version of who I want to be. I go to bed feeling like, shoot, I didn't,
Yeah.
So I feel like it's a beautiful message. If we can get past the no, this really is the better way. This really is. If we can get past that and humble enough to ask God, well, then you work on this. Show me what you want. It's not just so that the people around you can feel better. It's so that you can be happier too, I think.
It's a way more peaceful life. It really is. And I think that's what Paul's trying to do in Thessalonians. I think he's like, I don't want you to be caught. And that whole passage right there is put within the context of living within a pagan world, which is very interesting because, he's saying the way that you manage through a pagan world is not stand out and scream at the pagan world. The way that you do that is live a quiet life, work with your hands, and love God.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That is in that context.
It's a beautiful picture.
Okay, I'm going to transition us
out
of this into some rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. All right.
How is this with Clint, by the way?
The podcast?
Yeah.
Did you watch it?
I haven't seen it yet.
Aired today.
I know. I've been in meetings all day long until I came here.
I thought it was great.
Was it great?
I thought it was good. Yeah.
Good. I can't wait to see it.
Kelly said
I'm looking
great.
forward to it.
It's always fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so what game show do you think you could win?
What game show?
Yes.
Survivor.
100%. Oh, man.
100% I can
My brain didn't. I wish I was as cool as you. It did not go there at all.
I definitely have fantasies about being dropped off in a place and figuring out how to live. I feel like I could do it. I've got a little extra here. I can live off of for a few weeks. I'm going to be just
There's a show where couples are dropped up. Maybe it's The Amazing Race.
No,
could you do that?
You took it up. No.
I
Couples?
feel that I could do it with Clint.
No, Kelly has
myself.
No. Kelly has always told me, she goes, Mike, if some kind of weird apocalypse breaks out, zombie thing, she's like, I just want you to end it for me. I will not. She's like, I don't want to live through a situation like that. She is so funny about that.
Oh my goodness.
It's a constant joke in our family.
Survivor. Okay. We know you're craving it. What is the best carb?
What is the best? I love you said you know that I'm craving it. Yeah, I have fantasies about pot pie sometimes in my dreams. Yeah, it's ridiculous. I pretty much any kind of carb because I am a meatologist at this point. That's pretty much all I eat is a little bit of vegetable. These guys are laughing in the corner. And the only thing I pretty much do is I'll do some vegetables, and meat is pretty much kind of like my life at this point.
I just feel like
protein powder.
Fantasizing about pot pie. I would be going chocolate cake if I was.
Man, carbs sneak up on you in the weirdest ways. They're amazing.
Do you ever prank Kelly?
Pranker? Yeah, it doesn't go well. Yeah.
So is that a no?
No, not really.
Never early in your marriage?
No.
A little...
When we get off camera, though, I'll tell you guys a horrifying thing she did to me. I can't tell you online.
Oh, it's that bad?
It's just not a thing. Yeah, she's a wicked person. You know what you did.
Man.
Anyway, but yes,
So she pranks you?
She does occasionally. Yeah.
Oh, man.
She did one of these. Oh, so bad. And I'm also terrible because I never know what's the day where everybody pranks each.
April Fools.
April Fools. Yeah. I never pay attention to that. And she did it on April Fools, and I should have known better.
I could see her being real good at that.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Oh man. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on. Go get you some pot pie. I'll see you next time.
All right. See you next time.
Grace After Hours is a production of Grace Church in Orlando, Florida. Grace's mission is helping people take their next step toward Christ. Learn more at discovergrace.com. If you enjoy this podcast, share it with someone you know, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.